Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at something pretty interesting, I think, this whole relationship between radio and democracy.
Yeah, especially back in the 20s and 30s when radio was still this new, powerful thing.
Exactly. It's kind of a trip to think about. And our guide for this deep dive is this academic paper by David Goodman called Radio and Democratic Citizenship.
Oh, Goodman, yeah. His work is always thought-provoking. Lots of historical insights there.
So, we always hear about radio and democracy in terms of those big speeches like FDR's fireside chats, right?
The classic example.
But Goodman shows us there's way more to it than that, like how radio is actually used to shape democratic ideals in some pretty unexpected ways.
It's a much bigger story than just speeches, for sure.
So beyond those famous speeches, what else was going on? What does Goodman highlight?
Well, one of the first things he points out is this global trend toward nationalization and centralization of broadcasting.
Oh, interesting. When was this happening?
Mostly in the 1930s. It's like leaders all over the world, democracies, dictatorships, they all suddenly realize, hey, radio is powerful. We can reach tons of people directly with this thing.
So they wanted to control the message, basically.
Exactly. Control the narrative. And Goodman gives some pretty stark examples of this. Like in Nazi Germany, they completely took over broadcasting, turned it into a straight-up propaganda machine.
Wow. So, I mean, it's that double-edged sword, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, it could be used for good, but also for, really powerful propaganda.
Right.
Yeah.
Any other examples like that?
Yeah. The Soviet Union also shifted away from more local interactive radio.
Yeah.
And they went to this much more centralized system that was controlled from Moscow.
So it wasn't just like a Western thing?
Nope, not at all.
Uh.
Similar things were happening in China, Uruguay, even places like the UK and Australia.
Interesting.
And even in the U.S., with our strong commercial broadcasting system, we see the rise of national networks like NBC and CBS.
Right, which brought this whole other level of reach and influence, right?
Exactly.
It's just wild to see how this urge to harness radio played out in so many different political systems.
Definitely makes you wonder how all that impacted how citizens interacted with their leaders.
Yeah, I mean, did people feel closer to their leaders because of radio?
That's a big question that Goodman digs into. On the one hand, radio let leaders talk right into people's homes, right? They're right there in the living room with you. Created this whole new sense of personal connection.
So it felt, more intimate?
Yeah. And that's actually what Goodman calls it intimate broadcasting.
Intimate broadcasting. I kind of like that. Sounds cozy.
Yeah, there was definitely an element of that. Goodman even quotes this engineer from 1928, Alfred Norton Goldsmith. He said that radio was like restoring the intimate contact of the Roman Forum, but for democratic discourse.
Oh, wow. So they were thinking about it in those terms even back then.
Yeah, they were. It's like he saw radio as this modern-day public square where citizens and leaders could, actually connect on a personal level.
But did it really work that way?
Well, that's where it gets a little more complex. I mean, this idea of radio intimacy wasn't just an American thing. Goodman found this newspaper in New Zealand, the Timaru Herald, and they picked up on this whole concept from the New York Times. So it was definitely something people were talking about globally.
So the idea caught on, but did it actually foster real democratic participation?
That's what historians debate.
Ah, okay, so there are different opinions on that.
Oh, yeah. There are some historians, like Bruce Lenthal, who argue that, well, yeah, radio made politics feel more personal.
Right.
But it also made participation more private, almost passive.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Think about it. You're at home listening to a fireside chat. It feels cozy, connected. But are you actually part of a back and forth?
Yeah.
Or are you just kind of absorbed?
That's a good point. It's like that illusion of connection, but maybe not, real engagement. But didn't people write letters to the president?
Oh, they did. They did. And that's where Goodman brings in another historian, Jason Lavilio. He looked at all those letters written to Roosevelt during the Depression. And his research says those listeners actually saw themselves as active participants. They believed they could influence policy through their letters.
So it wasn't all passive, like we were saying.
Right. Not just sitting back and listening.
So it sounds like radio's impact on democracy was kind of, I don't know, complicated.
It was. It could create intimacy and passivity, connection and control all at the same time.
Yeah, that tension is something that Goodman keeps coming back to in his paper, huh?
He does. It's a good reminder that technology, even something that seems simple like radio, can have these really complex effects on how we engage with each other and with politics.
Absolutely. So we've talked about national leaders and this intimate broadcasting idea, but what about other ways people were trying to use radio to promote democratic ideals back then?
Oh, there were some. And some were really ambitious. Like, did you know that in several countries there was a push to broadcast live parliamentary debates?
Wait, really? Live debates on the radio? What was the point of that?
Transparency. It was all about making how the government worked more accessible to ordinary people. Let them see how things were happening, even if they couldn't physically be in parliament.
That's a cool idea. I like that. Where was this happening?
Goodman mentioned some early experiments in Finland, Germany, and Japan in the 1920s. And get this, New Zealand started broadcasting all their parliamentary debates in 1936.
Wow, ahead of their time. So this wasn't just like a fringe idea then. Was there any effort to do that in the US?
There was. Even in the U.S., with our commercial focus, there were these early proposals to broadcast Senate debates. Goodman mentions this senator from Nebraska, Robert Beecher Howell, who introduced a resolution to do just that back in 1924.
1924. Wow, imagine if that had taken off. Think how different things might be today if we could just tune into live Senate debates.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? But it shows this idea was a global thing. And it speaks to this bigger question of, how technology changes democratic engagement, both for better and potentially for worse, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great point. Speaking of engaging citizens, Goodman also talks about this whole thing called municipal broadcasting. What exactly was that?
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, especially in the U.S. Municipal broadcasting was basically city-funded radio stations.
It's TV funded.
Yeah. The idea was to have public service broadcasting without, the commercial influence.
So like giving citizens more control over this new powerful medium.
Yeah, it was. And it was a pretty optimistic vision. Goodman quotes this 1924 article from the Christian Science Monitor. They described it as a way to promote better citizenship by connecting people to their local governments, like using radio for the public good.
Sounds pretty idealistic. So did it work? Did these stations actually live up to those high hopes?
Well, like any big experiment, there were some bumps along the way.
Hmm.
A lot of them, yeah. They struggled financially. It was tough to keep them going.
Makes sense, I guess. Public funding, always a challenge.
And then on top of that, there were these controversies about political bias.
Oh, so even back then, it was hard to keep things impartial.
You got it. It's a
Yeah.
recurring theme, right?
Yeah.
Goodman gives examples from New York and Baltimore where mayors were accused of using the stations for, political propaganda.
Oh, so it kind of backfired on that whole idea of citizen-controlled broadcasting.
It did, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But even with those challenges, it was a genuine attempt to give citizens more say in this new medium.
Yeah, it makes you think, are there any lessons there for us today? I mean, we're still dealing with those questions about media ownership and control, aren't we?
Totally. It's a reminder that even with the best intentions, creating a truly democratic media landscape is tough. It takes constant work. But hey, let's move on to something a little more successful, at least for a while. Goodman takes us to the Educational Radio Project, which ran in the U.S. from 1935 to 1940.
The Educational Radio Project. Never heard of that one.
It's kind of flown under the radar, but it's pretty ambitious. The U.S. Office of Education teamed up with NBC and CBS.
Yeah, the big networks.
Yeah, and together they produced 12 educational radio series.
What were they teaching people about?
Well, the goal was promoting democratic values.
Interesting. So like straight up lectures about how the government works.
No, they were way more creative than that. These series used like dramatizations, fictional sketches, all kinds of things to get their message across.
So they were already experimenting with different ways to use radio.
Exactly. They were ahead of their time in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
One of the series, Americans All, Immigrants All, actually won awards for promoting tolerance and celebrating the contributions of immigrants.
Wow. Seems like a very relevant theme right now, given all the conversations we're having about diversity and inclusion these days.
It's true. It's like they were tapping into this fundamental aspect of the American experience that's still so important today.
Right, right. And it wasn't just feel-good stories, was it?
No. Another series, Democracy in Action, got into the nitty-gritty of how the government actually works, from transportation to social welfare. They even had a series called Gallant American Women, highlighting women's contributions throughout history.
So they were tackling some pretty big issues, not shying away from anything. What was the thinking behind all of this? Why did they create these programs?
Well, the driving force was this guy, John S. Studebaker, who was the commissioner of education at the time. And he believed that democracy wasn't just a system, but a way of life. you know?
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So radio wasn't just about giving people information about politics. It was about shaping them into active, engaged citizens.
So more than just teaching, but actually like cultivating democratic values.
Exactly. And here's another thing. It wasn't just about those big network broadcasts.
Really? How so?
They also created recordings for local stations and schools. One example Goodman gives is Pleasantdale Folks. This program designed to explain well, back then it was new, the Social Security system.
Ah, so reaching people at the local level.
Right. And they took it even further. They had this thing called the script exchange. They would send civically oriented scripts to communities all over the country.
What was the purpose of that? Just to provide content.
More than that, it was about encouraging local production and performance. Schools, community groups. The idea was to get people participating, not just listening. A real grassroots effort to promote civic engagement, you know?
It's almost like they were creating this whole network of citizen broadcasters. I'm sensing a theme here, this real focus on active citizenship. Now, one area Goodman really highlights is the project's work on public health, especially during
Oh
epidemics.
yeah, it's a big one.
Kind of relevant these days, don't you think?
It's uncanny how much it resonates with what we went through with COVID, you know? They use radio dramas to show how crucial public health measures were and how important individual responsibility was for preventing outbreaks.
So, way back then, they were already dealing with those tensions between individual freedom and the collective good, huh?
Exactly. That tension is timeless, it seems. Goodman gives these great examples from scripts they made for Trenton, New Jersey. One was about the need for public health measures to prevent typhoid outbreaks, emphasized the city's duty to protect its citizens.
And the other?
The other one focused on tuberculosis, but it highlighted how one person's choices could impact everyone else. That sense of interconnectedness, you know?
Right. It's amazing how much those themes from the 1930s still apply today. Those big questions about individual responsibility, government action, the common good, they never really go away, do they?
They don't. And remember how they gave guidelines for localizing the scripts? That was to encourage communities to adapt them to their own specific situations.
Hmm.
Foster a sense of ownership over the message, you know?
So it wasn't just about broadcasting information, it was about empowering communities to actually do something about public health.
That's it. Active citizenship again. And Goodman connects those public health scripts back to that series we talked about, Democracy in Action. He points out how they often use historical epidemics to show the government's role in keeping people safe.
Oh, that's interesting. So using history to make a case for government involvement.
Exactly. They had episodes about quarantine measures going all the way back to the 1600s, and others focused on yellow fever and typhoid outbreaks. The point was to show how the government has stepped up throughout history to protect people during these crises.
So trying to build trust in the government's ability to handle those kinds of threats, kind of the opposite of what happened with that War of the Worlds broadcast, right? That really played on people's fears.
What a contrast, right?
Yeah.
War of the Worlds showed how radio could create panic, uncertainty. But the Educational Radio Project was sending this more reassuring message, you know, the government as protector.
Yeah, it seems like they were walking a tightrope there, trying to educate people about real dangers, but without causing widespread fear.
For sure. And it's a good reminder that media can be used to push different narratives about the government. Sometimes those narratives make you feel safe. Sometimes they make you feel afraid. But the key is to be aware of those narratives, right?
Yeah.
Think about how they're shaping what we believe.
It's amazing to think about, those early radio folks, they were already grappling with all these questions about media and public opinion and the government.
It really is. It makes you wonder, what can we learn from them, right, as we try to navigate our own crazy media landscape?
Exactly. I mean, think about it. We've got social media, streaming, podcasts like this one. It's a whole different world.
Totally. So much has changed since those early radio days, but maybe the core challenges haven't really changed that much.
Yeah, I think so.
I kind of do. Like, aren't we still dealing with those same tensions between control and freedom, between using media to inform and to, well, manipulate?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And Goodman, he really gets you thinking about that. He keeps reminding us that technology itself isn't the problem. It's how we use it, right?
So, it's our responsibility to be smart about the media we consume and create.
Exactly.
Right.
We can't just be passive. We got to question what we're seeing and hearing, look for different perspectives, actually engage in dialogue, even when it's tough.
I like that. Constructive dialogue. It does seem like we've lost a bit of that lately, haven't we?
I think so. It's so easy to get stuck in those echo chambers, those filter bubbles online, just surrounded by people who agree with you.
Right, right.
But that doesn't help anyone, does it?
Mm.
In a democracy, we need to be able to hear each other out, even when we totally disagree.
It's like we need to rediscover that sense of a shared purpose, like what those early radio folks had.
Yeah. Back then, whether they were broadcasting those debates or making educational shows or promoting public health messages, there was this idea that media could be a force for good, something that brings people together.
Makes our democracy stronger.
Exactly. And honestly, that message feels more important than ever these days, don't you think? We're facing so many issues that need us to, work together to actually find solutions.
Couldn't agree more. So I guess as we continue to explore this ever-expanding media landscape, we should keep those early radio pioneers in mind.
I think so too. Remember their vision,
Yeah.
for a more informed, more engaged, more active public.
Right. So everyone listening out there, think critically. Ask questions. Don't be afraid to have those tough conversations.
And never forget, you have the power to shape the future of our media and our democracy.
That's a great thought to leave everyone with. Well, thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive into the world of radio and democratic citizenship. It's been a fascinating journey.
My pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep listening.